Alright, guys. So I'm going to probably keep this rather short. I say this all the time. We'll see. I'm definitely going to stick to spoiler free here because I definitely do want to do a deep dive, full spoiler discussion on this. But since it just came out last night or morning before, if you consider like the midnight premieres on Thursday, but it's brand new. So most people haven't seen this yet. I don't even know the general feeling towards this movie or the consensus or anything. I've talked to maybe 3 or 4 friends who have seen this also, and we compared opinions. That's pretty much it. So I don't know if this is getting rave reviews, if it's getting mostly praise, if it's mixed. But Maxxxine from this year, this was one of my most anticipated films of the year. Pretty much my most anticipated. I mean, Terrifier 3, when it comes to slashers, I'm looking forward to very, very much. But a little history just with the first 2 movies in this and how I feel about them in this trilogy. X and Pearl both made my top horror movies of 2022. They were both tied for number 1. I think both movies are masterpieces. More so Pearl. I put Pearl over X a bit, but both of those films are absolutely excellent. So we have the sequel to X here, Maxxxine, following our titular character, Maxxxine Minx, from the one messed up horror film crime scene at the end of X to 1985 in California. Just to get initial thought out of the way, I loved this. I loved this movie for the most part. There are some flaws, but I thought this was mostly excellent too. But it's definitely, at least on after just one watch of Maxxxine, it's my least favorite out of the 3. Like that I can say for sure. Now, will rewatches and watching them in order or anything like that change that? Sure, it possibly can. But after this first watch and how much I adore X and Pearl, this just isn't on the same level as those 2 movies. The cast here is great. I mean, Mia Goth kills it, as usual. Think of her performance in X, but amplified a lot more because we're mostly just following Maxxxine throughout this whole movie compared to X, where we had the little ensemble cast of characters. There are other characters in this. We have Giancarlo Esposito from Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, who I think is one of the greatest TV bad guys, with Gus Fring, with that character. We have Kevin Bacon as the private investigator in this. He does a great job too. The hell's her name? DeBecky, something like that. I don't watch whatever show she's from. She's good in this too. But one thing I can compare to Pearl and Mia Goth's performance in that, this movie has no moments that are like Pearl, that really showcase Mia Goth's acting skills. Like I said, she kills it in Maxxxine. There's just not that next level, especially everyone thinks of the monologue, which is fantastic at the end of Pearl. There's nothing on that level of caliber acting throughout this movie. Having said that, though, and really liking Kevin Bacon's performance and Giancarlo Esposito when he's there, you spend most of this movie with Maxxxine. So a lot of the other characters aren't fleshed out that much. I don't know if that was deliberate, because, I mean, the whole film here takes place in 85. We have the Night Stalker and the Satanic Panic happening. All of Hollywood is shooken up from Richie Ramirez, the Night Stalker. Everyone's freaking out. They show a nice little montage in the beginning of, with Dee Snider coming to talk with the MPAA or the record labels, and all the satanic records, films, and the fear cult and all that. So, like always, Ty West captures the time period perfectly in this. This movie, the biggest thing going for this movie is the style of it. This is a beautiful film, just like the last 2. But this one, I think, is the most stylish. Alright, let me rephrase this. Pearl is very stylish also. Like how it's filmed in that old time Hollywood, like golden age of Hollywood look to it, and the fonts and everything. So I don't mean in that type of style, but when it comes to the color and the lighting and heavy giallo aspects throughout this entire movie, which I love. Italian horror, for those who don't know. So in terms of like the most stylish in that vein, this movie takes the cake with the style. All the camera work is great in this. All the dialogue, for the most part, is great in this. The cinematography of this movie, like I said, is gorgeous. And just like Ty West nailed the 70s feel in X, and I forget what it takes, like what the 1910s, 1920s, whatever it is, in Pearl. Same with House of the Devil with this time period. He is just excellent at really making you feel like you're there in whatever decade he's trying to make you feel like you're in. And he pretty much just does the same, if not maybe a little better job than he always has in this film. I'm going to try to be as vague as possible with a synopsis in case no one knows what exactly is happening in this sequel. But I'll preface that with saying you have to have at least seen X before watching this movie. Pearl, now, out of the 3 movies, seems like that's the one you can watch the most on its own and enjoy the hell out of it, and you don't really need to have seen Maxxxine, especially, or X. I mean, you'll miss some cute little callbacks and tie-ins, but it stands on its own. This movie, you have to have seen X. You can't just watch Maxxxine on its own. But then again, I can't fault the movie for that, because it's a sequel. Pearl was a prequel. Prequels, a lot of times, you don't have to see the original to just watch and enjoy a prequel. When it comes to a sequel, a direct sequel to the first movie in this trilogy, yeah, it's essential that you have seen X before. But the short synopsis, Maxxxine, after fleeing the events of X, it's 1985, she's in Hollywood, she's a pretty known porn actress, but she's not at the level of fame that she wants, and that's something this whole movie plays on, is the pursuit of fame, just like this whole series, and lives not being fulfilled and never reaching the potential that either delusionally you thought you had, or that you actually do have, and you just never reached it, never got there, and the crushing of dreams. All of that is still prevalent throughout this whole movie. Probably more so than the other 2 films, since this is actually set in Hollywood. And we see Maxxxine trying to make the transition from porno films to a horror film, or actual movies, to put a blanket over it. But she ends up being cast in this horror film, which is a sequel to a very popular, pretty sure fake, I've never heard of it, The Puritan is the original movie in this universe. So apparently it was like a cult hit that in 30 years, as one of the characters says, it'll be looked upon as like a cult masterpiece. And now she's cast in The Puritan too. And during all this, we have the Night Stalker stuff that's going on, but we'll get there with the Night Stalker. And Maxxine's past comes back to haunt her. Kevin Bacon plays the private investigator who knows a lot about her past, and people start dying. That's pretty much all you need to know going into this sequel, and I'm being as vague as possible. Alright, so before we dive into the flaws I had with this, quick recap on the pros. The acting is excellent. The cinematography is excellent. The sets and all the camera work, all the shots, the color, the neon lights in Hollywood at night, the feel of the 80s, all of that is brilliant in this movie, and I highly enjoyed it. The few negatives I have with this and what holds it down below the other 2 for me. This one doesn't hold it down that much. actually, because I talked to a few people about this. X, on its own, I don't really consider even a slasher film, because I feel like the story is center focus, that it's more than a slasher for me. So, yeah, it's definitely in the slasher mold, and we get a lot of great kills in that movie. I just don't consider it a slasher, just like with Halloween, the original. I don't consider that movie a slasher film. I have weird guidelines that I go by to categorize movies. I wouldn't call this a slasher film either. And Pearl isn't. I always look at that as just a character study. A period piece character study into the character of Pearl. So I didn't have any slasher expectations coming into this movie. As high as my excitement, my hype was for this film, I was able to keep my expectations pretty much in check, that I wouldn't be completely fanboying over this movie and that I wouldn't be completely let down, which I'm not completely let down. I'm a little let down. But little is the emphasis, and again, on rewatches, I'm sure this can go up. But the first flaw, the kills in this movie, they are good. They're just not on the level of X at all. And they're not as memorable. A lot of things in this movie aren't as memorable as the first time you saw X or the first time you saw Pearl. That's one of the biggest flaws. Now, the kills, they're fine to suit this movie. That's why it's not that big of an issue for me. They're not as good as X, but again, I'm not looking at this film as any particular genre, and I didn't walk into this movie thinking of it as a slasher film. I already said how I feel about X regarding it as a slasher film. So the kills weren't as important to me over the stories, the most important for me, in this sequel, because I wasn't expecting the kills to be over the top or to be, like a focal point of the movie in any way. So the kills are good. They're just not as memorable, but it's not a huge thing for me. Other events, though, that happen in this movie just aren't as memorable as the past two films. They don't stick with you immediately, like, oh shit, like that scene was crazy. Like the gator scene in X. Everyone remembers that scene. Like everybody. It's become a famous scene in just 2 years that X has been out, a little over that. This movie doesn't have, it has memorable moments, but there's no like, oh shit moments like that scene would be considered an X, or the kill with the red lighting from the car when the blood splatters on it to Don't Fear the Reaper. Like, there's no moments on that level in Maxxxine for me. Another flaw that I had with this, and it's not the biggest thing, because there's kind of an explanation for why they did it this way, but not fully. All the Richie Ramirez Night Stalker stuff, it just doesn't feel fleshed out at all. It feels like it's there just to be in the background and just to be in your head, and that it might tie into the story. And it does in a way, just by being part of the time period and the location. And it actually was going on at that time. So it does make sense being there, but it doesn't go anywhere. And yeah, in case you don't want anything really spoiled, I'd click off now. I'm not really going into spoilers, but some of these critiques can possibly give something away. So yeah, if you don't want any spoilers at all, at this point, 10-something minutes in, you could figure out, I really enjoyed it. I think it's mostly excellent. I'm just a tad let down compared to how much I love X and Pearl. And there's definitely a few flaws in this movie that prevent it from, topping the other two in almost any way except for the style. But if you plan on going and seeing it, I hope you guys enjoy the hell out of it, because I mostly did. Alright, so slight spoilers, but yeah, the Night Stalker stuff doesn't really amount to anything. Like at the end of the movie, sure, let's go a little spoilers. We hear the Night Stalker was caught and arrested. Totally separate from everything going on with Maxxxine and her past coming back to haunt her and all the events that happen in this movie. He's just out and about killing people, like on the news reports and stuff. You know he's a threat and that he's lurking in Los Angeles. Then he just gets captured in something we don't see or anything. Again, we hear about it on the news report near the end of the movie. So it's its own little side thing that's there just to add to the authenticity of the time period and to maybe throw you off a bit and make you think the Night Stalker is more directly involved, but he's not at all. So that's one thing I feel like they didn't flesh out much at all. And again, it could be deliberate. It could be because of the time period. That's the only reason he put it in there. But it is deceptive, like in a bad way, with all the Night Stalker stuff. And I did remember that from the trailer. And then have it amount to pretty much nothing important in the story of Maxxine's life. Another thing, and this is why I'm so mixed on this, and I know I'll have to watch this movie again to get full opinions, and that's when I'll do a full spoiler discussion deep dive on it. Because I'm not sure how many of these flaws and negatives for me can really be put on the movie itself. Like I said, there's a lot of stuff in here that isn't as memorable. There's also a lot of predictable stuff in this movie. A lot of the theories that me and friends had on where this would go and how it would end, leaving off chronologically where we were at the end of X, pretty much were correct on all of those theories. Like, there's not too many big surprises here, and you can pretty much see the ending coming, and at least who's behind it, and why, and especially with the whole satanic panic thing going on. So there wasn't any big reveals or twists or, like anything like that for this movie. But, again, it's a sequel that's rounding out a trilogy, and it does that very well. Like, at the end of Maxxxine here, everything from the previous two movies, this whole trilogy, is pretty much tied up perfectly with a neat bow, and you don't really have any questions left. But the reason I don't know if I can throw fully on the movie is because it's a sequel, and we know a lot of Maxxine's history and her past, and we also know the parallels between Pearl and her from both X and the parallels we see in that movie, and then the parallels we see in Pearl's character in the movie Pearl. So it makes sense that there wouldn't be as many surprises, tying up this story. It all falls into place. Like, it makes sense all the way that this story comes to its conclusion. It makes complete sense. It's not bad in any way. I do have a little bit of issues with how the ending 20 minutes or so, 30 minutes, is handled, but it still makes total sense. And like I said, it ties this series up pretty damn well. And we have a decent amount of callbacks and tie-ins with the previous two movies, just like Pearl and X complement each other there. Honestly, that's pretty much it when it comes to the negatives that I had with this. Like I said, it's an excellent movie. It's not a masterpiece, how I consider Pearl, and X is like a near masterpiece movie for me. There's maybe a flaw or two in that. Pearl is just splendid. This is last place. And it sucks, because this was pretty much my most anticipated horror film of the year. So, did it live up to that? No. And that's the part that's disheartening. But the negatives are few and far between, and like I said, some of them I can't fully blame on the film, and it's because we already have so much backstory on this character, and that this is an actual chronological sequel to X. So there's not as many surprises and twists, but there doesn't really need to be. And the same with the kills. They're not as good, they're not as memorable as the last two movies, especially X. But the kills have never been a focal point of the prior two movies for me. So maybe that wasn't as big of a negative for me as it was for other people. The style, as I keep saying, is just the standout of this movie. And maybe just because I'm such a big giallo and Italian horror fan, and there are definitely a few homages to certain movies in the Italian subgenre. I won't get into here, not to spoil things, but there are for sure. But maybe that's the reason that it stood out to me so much, and that I loved just all the technical aspects of this movie and the lighting and all that. But altogether, Maxxxine from this year, it's a very fitting end to what I consider one of, if not the best, modern post-2000s horror trilogy. There's not many others I can think of, especially off the top of my head right now, trilogies of horror movies that are on this level. So it still holds the trilogy up fine. And I'm sure I'll come around to it and enjoy it even more on a rewatch. Great acting, Mia Goth is great, just not to the level of performance we see in Pearl from her. But it's absolutely worth it if you're a fan, even remotely, of X and Pearl, or one or the other. But like I said, you definitely have to have seen X to go see this movie. You don't really necessarily have to have seen Pearl, but it'll definitely help your whole enjoyment. And if you haven't seen Pearl at this point, the fuck are you waiting for? Watch Pearl. That's the masterpiece of this trilogy. And I know as soon as I end this that oh shit, I forgot to mention this and this and this. That's how my brain's been working after watching this and thinking about it. It's going all over the place trying to process it. So again, a rewatch could definitely make this a much better film than it already is, and maybe bring it up to the same level. I don't think it'll hit the same level of X, and hence nowhere near Pearl, but it's possible. But if any of you have seen Maxxxine, what do you guys think? Is it a favorite in the trilogy for you? Is it last place like it is for me? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Leave it in the comments. Definitely interested in hearing more from people who have also seen the film. Alright guys, see you tonight. Take care.